His last service was as an ambassador was in Ethiopia, ambassador to Tanzania in Ethiopia, and from there he served as a principal director of the Center for Foreign Relations, a center which trains diplomats. And originally, I think it still is, the center was jointly and is jointly owned by Tanzania and Mozambique. And so having introduced the panelists, let me also introduce myself as the chair. My name is Nwanza Kamata. I am a member of academic staff in the Department of Political Science and the chair of the department. Having said that, I would like to invite the first speaker, and each one will have 20 minutes to make the presentation. And I will invite now Dr. Lupa to make a presentation on behalf of Professor Opoku Ageman. Dr. Lupa, karibu.
Asante sana, Mwenyekiti. Thank you, the chair. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Okay. Now, on behalf of Professor Ageman, I would like to present the paper that he has prepared on Pan-Africanism and its realistic prospects for the future. Now, he prepared a fully fledged paper, over 40 pages, and with the time that we have, I'm sure I will not be able to do that. So I'll try as much as possible to summarize the paper, but while maintaining the main message that he wanted to deliver. Now, in this paper, Professor Ageman has laid bare in the most forceful and penetrating way the plight of Africans as a people. He takes a deep-rooted approach to the African concept, which embraced a unified resistance front, not only of black residents in the African continent, but all the black people wherever they are found. It traces Pan-Africanism, showing how it has shifted from a global movement embracing all people of black descent in the world to a battered and a relegated continental movement today. Now, it is a pity that he is not here to deliver this paper. But without much ado, I'll present the gist of the ideas, as I said, in the time that I've been given. Now, he started with the background. The background says Africans bear a history of hundreds of years of dehumanizing, stigmatizing, enslavement wrought by the Arabs and then the Europeans. The horrific nature of bondage and its longevity engraved on Africans an enduring image of natural servitors to other races. Africans across 1,000 years underwent the lowest and the most fatal degree of suffering, prompting hyperbolic indictment that Africa has been a slave reservoir since history began. The seeming endlessness of the coupling of Africans with the servitude and the degradation placed Africans firmly at the bottom of the social universe. Thereupon, it became impossible to see how a globally marginalized, disrespected, even despised people could ever regain their full human nature without first bringing about by themselves a drastic revolutionary overhaul over their condition. Such a huge project, as in any other deliberate human undertaking, required the preceding intervention of thought. And so, over time, became clear that an indispensable precondition of a redeeming racial transformation is a carefully formulated thought system, a worldview, and ideology. Going as far back as the later part of the 19th century, Africans in the diaspora showed through intellectual production and organizing endeavors that they had a good idea where they needed to go and how to go there, how to get there. A Trinidadian, Henry Sylvester William, founded the African Association in Britain in 1871 and then went on to organize a Pan-African conference in London in 1900. This conclave manifested a growing interest among black people from Africa and the diaspora toward uniting in some way to address what they saw as the common struggle against the many and the various forms of racial exploitation. And subsequent congresses, we know them, 1919 in Paris, in London and Brussels, 1921, London and Lisbon, 1923. All these were organized by the organizer of these conferences pronounced therefrom that should the Negro become a factor in world history, this will be through a pan-Negro movement. The emergence of a comprehensive substantive ideology for the emerging Pan-African movement, however, had to await the arrival of Marcus Garvey upon the American scene in 1916. Garvey acknowledged that, I'm very sorry. I don't know whether you even followed from when I started. But I was talking about Professor Ageman pressing the origin of the concept of Pan-Africanism as an idea embracing all the black race. And he traces them through the famous conferences in the 1900s. But then that the emergence of a comprehensive substantive ideology for the emerging Pan-African movement took root when Marcus Garvey came into the scene in 1916. He's an American. He acknowledged that objective realities of long-standing powerlessness and subjugation had set the race apart and removed it from the realm of respectability. It was apparent to Garvey that African people by themselves had supplied all the reasons by which the world ignores and avoids them. The fact of the matter is that being down for a long time and not being able to bounce back represents a major problem, especially for other human categories who also took a fall at some points in their history, managed to get back on their feet. It is not helpful to draw on arguments about unequal burdens and degrees of victimization. It is certainly a more cogent argument that the steeper the fall, the greater the resolve of the human spirit to raise up and overcome. The implementation of the imperative of Afrocentricity was pursued by Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association in a Back to Africa campaign, which immediately triggered the opposition of European colonial powers and the hostility of the United States government in particular, resulting in the incarceration of Garvey on a trumped-up charge. It fell to Kwame Nkrumah, a self-proclaimed disciple of Garvey, to plant the ideology on African soil. What he set out to do and not to do defined the hollow praxis of the ideology from the 1960s to to the present. All told, the riddle here revolves around his perplexing ideological somersault from Garveyism into Afro-Arab continentalism. So that is the first shift. Of all things, he began now to counterpose African nationalism to the black nationalism. That is Kwame Nkrumah, of Marcus Garvey. Almost overnight, a sacred cause whose constituents in the universe of blighted and degraded race of black people is belittled and relegated. Suddenly, it was not the black race whose cause and destiny was paramount and indivisible, but rather, as he put it in his 1963 work titled Africa Must Unite, a once and indivisible Africa extending from Tangier or Cairo in the north to Cape Town in the south. Now, against the widespread fervent expectations across the black diaspora of Pan-African Congress on African soil, he chose instead to organize in Ghana in 1958 a purely continental all-African people's conference limited to Arabs and Africans on the continent, the precursor to the Organization of African Unity that emerged in 1963. And as Nkrumah led the way, the other African leaders followed in this disembowelment of fundamental Pan-Africanism. Even the usually contentious Julius Nyerere, who was wont to counter-argue Nkrumah's position on a host of issues, fell in line in extolling the OAU as being not a black man's organization, but an organization including men of all colors. The Arab League was formed to represent the totality of the urges and hopes and determinations which inherit the Arab soul. At the core of this project was a racial essence of the concept of Arab peoplehood, against which all other bases of identity among the Arabs, religious or geographic or otherwise, paled into insignificance. Clearly, Arab participation in a continentalism propelled by Nkrumah's geographic rationale could only be out of opportunistic calculation and not anything to do with the commitment to shared Afro-Arab interests and solidarity. It goes without saying that the Western world posed a fundamental threat to Pan-Africanism at every stage. As Wallerstein noted, the United States, which at the end of the Second World War did not hesitate to push for European integration through the European Economic Cooperation Act of 1948, would move decisively in the 1960s to prevent the consolidation of any revolutionary movement toward the unification of the African states on the contention that it might severely affect the balance of forces in the world. Nonetheless, it is patently arguable that turning away from the massive spiritual and emotional capital of a Pan-African ideology embedded and rooted in centuries of horrendously tragic destruction, disgrace, and the downgrading of a race in order to join forces with another race of people who themselves played a considerable role in the destruction and the usurpation of black civilization, was going to make it virtually impossible for Nkrumah to accomplish the goals his unification campaign hoped to accomplish. Emphatically, the greatest cause of the undoing of the project of Pan-Africanism, Pan-African unification, was Nkrumah's own mystifying ideological apostasy. Now, contemporary realities. An organization in Africa, by whatever name, if it delinked from the African diaspora, becomes an edifice without a foundation, a tree without fractured, eviscerated roots. The Organization of African Unity, or AU, and its successor, the African Union, would become just devitalized entities. Nkrumah and later Nyerere would desperately complain about the OAU's penetration by imperialism, which, with that massive number of client states that populated it. As for the successor AU, launched in 2002, its impairment from external financing was, from the first, manifestly unarguable. A key ideological postulate of Pan-Africanism from the very beginning was financial self-reliance, no matter what aid is involved. It was argued the end product, the facilitation in the recipient's affairs. In Malcolm X's elucidation, garnered from his rich experience of American politics, he says, no organization that is financed by white support can ever be independent enough to fight the power structure with the type of tactics necessary to get results. In order to fight it, we have to be independent of it. And the only way we can be independent of it is to be independent of all support from the white community. It is a battle that we have to wage ourselves. That is why Garvey was able to be more militant. Garvey didn't ask them for help. He asked our people for help. Insulated from this wisdom, the AU has emerged as a donor-dependent body, an organization characterized by a high dependency rate on its former colonizers. Aid is by far the largest source of its funding. All of this comes with an organizational headquarters in Addis Ababa, fully funded by the Chinese government and built by the Chinese State Construction Engineering Company. This patent inability of the organization to be self-funding often places it in the precarious situation. Africa is largely subordinate, peripheral, and a penetrated region in the international system, an agency-less victim of great power manipulations. Ali Mazrui was right on the mark in his take of the state of the world in 1977. He said, the most affluent societies in the world are overwhelmingly of European extraction. The poorest countries in the world are overwhelmingly black and African in racial extraction. Certainly, those countries categorized as the poorest by the United Nations are disproportionately situated in the African continent. If people of European extraction are the Brahminis of the international caste system, the black people belong disproportionately to the caste of the untouchables. The inferior quality of education immersed in subordination, the creation of mental confusion, and the development of underdevelopment constitutes one of Africa's deadly deficits. As Indemit Gill and Kenan Karakula have expatiated, this shortfall is at the core of most economy with low levels of education. Educational inferiority exudes self-alienating, downright irrelevant curriculum encrusted in colonial thinking, along with the negligible research culture. It has been a recurring refrain that Africa still lags woefully behind the rest of the world in generating new scientific knowledge, that the continent, home to around 16% of the world's population, produces less than 1% of the world's research output. The point of the matter, which cannot be too strongly emphasized, is that it is very difficult to achieve and maintain superpower status without global academic supremacy. A broad-based brain trust of homegrown, world-beating intellects has been a hallmark of every global hegemon in world history. Consider India. He gives an example of India. Who would have guessed what 25 years ago Jeffrey Sachs asks in 2005 that impoverished India would burst upon the world economy in 1990s through high-tech information services. But burst out it did by turning out for more than a generation high-quality entrepreneurs and engineers from the Indian Institute of Technology, IITs, a collection of 7 world-class, loosely affiliated campuses around the country. Power is the currency of international relations. Diminished power invites encroachments, incursions, and downright imperialism. Even the brightly dyed fabrics worn on the continent and in the diaspora as shirts, dresses, skirts, and even the occasional head wrap, the ubiquitous batik, inspired wax print that has come to denote Africanness, our batik, you know the batik, are entirely produced not in Africa, but in the Netherlands. Even more seriously, in the face of the Africans' demonstrable incapacity to build their own roads, railroads, dams, bridges, subways, or any of other major infrastructure. The Chinese have stepped into the breach with the untold billions of dollars of investments in mega projects across the continent. In the wake of Chinese Revolution 1949, the primary focus of Chinese foreign policy turned on the need to resist and deter the foreign invader and the plunderer. To this end, the leadership pulled all the stops to ensure that a nuclear device was detonated in 1964, followed by the test firing of an intercontinental ballistic missile in the South Pacific in mid-1980. Notably, in this endeavor of political redemption, China reached out and drew upon the 55 million overseas Chinese, a reservoir of talent, capital, and experience, who never lost sight of the fact that the unfair treatment of the Chinese in America, in particular, had a great deal to do with a divided and a weakened China. India's development trajectory bears the same hallmark of prioritization of national fortification based on nuclear weapons. So India has done the same, and you know the story of India nuclearization. During his tenure in office, a decision by Nkrumah to initiate a nuclear program in Kwabenya was prompted in particular by an awareness that apartheid South Africa was building a great military force with the latest weapons of destruction in order to crush nationalism in Africa. Following his overthrow in 1966, a rapid reversal of policy led to a drastic scaling down of this nuclear program. Now, even the most cynical analysts, the end result of the liberation of South Africa from apartheid rule turned out to be an elaborate hoax and appeasement, in despite of the fact that the whole sordid range of apartheid operation constituted a crime against humanity. In the end, as Christopher Gevers had succinctly put it, the crime of apartheid has never been prosecuted in South Africa or anywhere in the world. On top of this, the 1996 Constitution enshrined the strongest protection of minority rights anywhere in the world for the benefit of the Europeans who had been the beneficiaries of apartheid's heinous crimes and the injustices. Now, the future. Given the ubiquity and the lethal realities of anti-black racism around the world, it should not be difficult for keen minds to accommodate the existential summons of fundamentalist Pan-Africanism. A leader like Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, known for his intellectual capacity to adjust to emergent realities, would welcome a proposal for imperative ideological shifts in Africa's development trajectory at this stage of the 21st century. The leader who vigorously championed the regionalist gradualist, step-by-step approach to political integration suddenly changed the tune in 1966 and urgently argued the necessity for immediate all-African political unification in the face of a spate of foreign interventions that resulted in neo-colonial military ouster of some leaders, including notably Nkrumah. It is noteworthy that before this, in 1962, he unreservedly exposed and condemned the tendency of economically and developed and powerful socialist countries in Europe, whom he had regarded as international anti-imperialist allies to exploit poor African countries. Now, towards the end, he gives some recommendations on how to go forward with the future. And he says, the prospects of success in achieving the ideological goals of valorization and the evaluation of the race through the empowerment of a unified black super-state rests on a number of highly attainable preconditions. Now, there are three preconditions. The first one, Pan-African mobilization of the youth across the black world, utilizing a code of primordial African citizenship that gives every African in the diaspora a right to participate in the reorganization and the fortification of the ancestral home, because young people often have the desire, energy, and idealism to do something about the injustices they see in the world. B, massively, drastically revamped and revised school curriculum from the first grade up through a central mechanism of a university of the black world to achieve relevance and enhance motivation for surpassing accomplishments. The substructure of Pan-Africanism is African history, and so should be the curriculum of African schools and universities everywhere. Regarding Africa's ancient history, scholarship wrought from archaeological expertise, scholarships, and the field work would be strongly emphasized. And I give example of archaeological findings by the University of Chicago that establishes that Nubia is the oldest recognizable monarch in human history, that the various symbols of Nubian royalty are the same as those associated in later times with the Egyptian kings, that indeed the ancient Nubians reached a high stage of political development as long ago as 3,000 years before Christ. It is and several generations before the earliest documented Egyptian king. Nubian rulers sprang from a robust African civilization that had flourished on the southern bank of the Nile from 2,500 years, boasting of pyramids at El Kuru, Nuri, and Meroe that are greater in number than all of Egypt's. And he says it is remarkable that the ancient civilizations of Ethiopia, Nubia, and Egypt are excluded from classical studies of Western universities. They don't teach that in the West. The classics are about Greece and Rome. Egypt is in fact cut off from Africa and joined into Oriental studies. And the third and last, and the concluding one, a racial Pan-African project would bolster and release fraternal interactive developmental energy between the black nation and its overseas children. One only has to take a peek at the fruitful relationship that has been developed since 1948 between Israel and the American Jews. It is questionable whether there would be a state of Israel without the strategic contributions from American Jews, direct and indirect, in terms of philanthropic contributions travels to Jerusalem to participate firsthand in the Israel experience and the share cultural, social, and educational experiences out of which values are shaped and are reshaped, and through such pro-Israeli lobbying groups like the American Israeli Political Affairs Committee propel special political, economic, and defense linkages between Israel and the United States of America. With that, Mr. Chair, I wish to end there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lupa, for helping us to follow and get what Professor Opoku Ageman wanted to share with us. And you will agree with me, the paper is thought-provoking, and I think there will be a lot of questions and issues raised from the floor when we come to the time for discussion. Now, without much ado, let me invite the second panelist, Ambassador Dr. Mohamed Maundi. Karibu sana. 20 minutes. I was a bit reluctant to stop Lupa. It took some 5 minutes more because he was not presenting his paper. So I was a bit patient not to interrupt him, but I will with you.
Thank you. So that's a warning to me that it should be within the limited time that you're giving. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Okay. Let me start by appreciating the presence of who was a young diplomat at the Tanzania embassy there. That was the time during the OAU. And then I had the chance to be about 20 years later, in 2008 to 2011, during the time of AU. So I'm a living witness of both organizations, the OAU and the AU. And I think that should be my point of departure. The first question I think that will be interesting for discussion is the question of the change of name from OAU to AU. The question here is, was the change necessary? Or what is it that really prompted the change from the Organization of African Unity to African Union? Analysts have different explanation for that. One angle, people think that it was a mere imitation of the Europeans, because there was once something called Economic Commission, Economic Community of European Economic Community, and then it transformed itself to European Union. And then maybe African were kind of a little lazy to kind of conceptualize exactly what they want. So it was a mere copy from the European Union, then we have the African Union. So that is one angle of explaining why the change of name from OAU to EU. I mean from OAU to African Union. But another angle is, people say, well, the word has changed because OAU lived for 39 years before it was African Union. So they say within that time period, a lot of water went through the bridge. The world has transformed itself. So maybe it was time not to cling to the old name, the Organization of African Unity. And the time has come that Africa should transform itself. So maybe that is a justifier to the change of the name to African Union. But others attribute it really made by the leader of Libya, brother Muammar Gaddafi, because he really contributed and financed a lot the discussion about the transformation from OAU to AU. Now here there is a catch. Those who attribute the change of the name to Muammar Gaddafi say that he was reviving a Nkrumah kind of ambition for having a United States of Africa. Now, Nkrumah, when he was putting that idea, he was accused of being a megalomaniac, somebody who really was power hungry. He went through the whole of the continent. So the same accusation also was labeled to Muammar Gaddafi of saying, oh, he's bringing this idea, he's reviving this idea of having one government in Africa because he wants to be the king of African kings. So the accusation was went that way. But then there were those who actually thought that the aspect of changing the name from the OAU to AU was the element of, it was cosmetic, they say. Shakespeare once said, what is in a name? A rose with whatever name, it will still smell as sweet. So it was cosmetic, change the name. Time has passed, get away of the OAU, call it with the new name AU. So they thought it was due to that kind of, it is just like a case of the old wine in a new bottle. The thing is the same, but then you are giving it a new name. So I think this should be an interesting point for discussion. The question here is, was it really a matter of just changing the name, or there was something really particular about this? Now, let me ask myself to help us in that discussion is, what is so new about the African Union, which is quite different from the OAU, one would say? Looking at it structurally, you can see the very old structures still exist, but more than that, some other more were added to it. So within the new parameters of the new African Union, we have an institution which was not there, like Peace and Security Council. That is a new thing. And then we have something like the Pan-African Parliament. It was not there. So this is new. And then we have something like new Partnership for African Development, NEPAD, out of which we have something we call the African Peer Review Mechanism. So these are all new structures within the with this organization called now the African Union. So it may be still the same, but then you have these other structures. Another thing is the element of focus. Mind you, by the time the AU is coming up, Africa had already succeeded into the first phase of liberation, the political struggle. By this time, all African countries were already independent. So now launching the second phase, which is the most difficult, the economic liberation, the economic development. So it needed a new vigor, it needed a new kind of inspiration to do that. So in a sense, yeah, I would say that come 1963, the OAU was formed, and 9 years later, it was transformed to something else. But then maybe it is important to see where is the OAU coming from. The OAU came out of the Pan-Africanism kind of struggle that was universal in the sense. It was looking at the black element of slavery, colonialism, and all that kind of thing. But you see, its origin and its practice was more outside Africa than in Africa itself. Until 1945, after the Second World War, when Africans who participated in the war Africans who were in Europe and Americas for education, they started to participate. But for them, they were calling now for African liberation, for decolonization. So 1963 was actually the idea of planting the aspiration of Pan-Africanism into the continent. And by 63, when the OAU was formed, it was the actualization of that aspiration of Pan-Africanism. Now, having the organization already, and then its existence for almost over 39 years, people have to do some analysis, or rather some kind of review, whether it has performed according to the objective of the organization itself. Now, out of this, of course, there were a lot of criticisms about the performance of the organization. There are some who thought, well, the performance was, there were some achievements out of this, because the objectives of the OAU, if one could sum just a few of them, one was to promote unity and the solidarity among African states. Two, to rid the African continent of the remnants of colonialism and apartheid. Of course, three, to safeguard the sovereignty and territorial integrity of member states, and then to coordinate for economic development. So looking at these objectives, people have been doing some analysis of saying whether the OAU achieved its objective. Now, the criticisms are many, but the few, and one of the most is OAU was nothing but a club of African leaders where they could meet annually, like going to the Hajj. It was an annual pilgrimage. They will meet, discuss, and then go home. So it was nothing, actually. It was like a trade union, if you want. This is one of the accusation, or rather of the criticism of the organization. Another criticism is the OAU was merely a bureaucratic talking shop which had no teeth. It had no enough power really to kind of being effective on the ground. And another criticism, it was on the basis of the creation, or rather the call for having a continental union, which Nkrumah really aspired. And then they said, well, Nkrumah was power hungry, he wanted this, so nothing could be achieved out of that after they didn't heed to what Nkrumah wanted. And another criticism is the OAU leadership did not discriminate among the African leaders. This means what? It means within the workings of the OAU then, and I think still within the AU, the leadership of the organization was rotational on an annual basis. Every year, one leader will be elected to be the chair of the organization. Now, in that, African leaders were looked into two categories: the good leaders who were really committed to work for their people, and then, quote unquote, the bad ones, whom they were called dictators. Now, in the choice of leadership of the OAU, there was no discrimination. It was rotational. So when a turn of one region comes up, somebody is be picked regardless of his ideological or his political performance. So you had people, I don't want to mention names, who were not supposed to be leaders of, of the continent, but they got a chance. So the criticism is Africa was not really refining the good leaders who should be prominent into leading of this organization. And then, of course, another criticism which is more prominent is the African leaders, or rather, Africa has failed. The Africans have failed, the leaders of Africa have failed even to kind of protect their own tyrants, in the situation that these leaders were not performing according to what they were supposed to do. So they were undemocratic, they were dictatorial, and the OAU failed to get rid of these kind of things. So these are the kind of criticism that was labeled to this organization. Now, that said, was there any, or something that we could say the OAU was able to achieve some kind of positive thing? Of course it did. And then the achievements also were also many, but I can just enumerate few. The mere continuation of the organization for over 39 years, you could say that was positive, because some organizations are formed and then they die before real objective. But the OAU was able to exist that long. I'm saying the mere existence of this organization from 1963 all the way to the year 2002 when it was formed, or we could say up to this day through its successor organization of the AU. That by itself, we could say it is an achievement. But then the organization, of course, it worked as an African lobby within the workings of the UN under the name of the African Group. It was always working with the UN to champion the interest of Africa. And for me, that is positive. A third achievement, I would say, was the establishment, and this was the first institution established by the OAU in 1963 of the liberation movement. And everybody, particularly Tanzania, know how much this committee has worked for the betterment, or rather for the liberation of countries in Southern Africa. So countries like Mozambique, Angola, Namibia, Zimbabwe, where my professor comes from, Namibia, South Africa, they benefited a lot from the work of the Liberation Committee. So when you look at the success or achievement of the Organization of African Unity, the liberation work is one of the most successful achievement that the OAU has achieved. Another achievement, I think, is the establishment of the Regional Economic Organization. And I think this is in line with the ideological debate that pitted among the Monrovia group and the Casablanca group, which would say definitely the Monrovia group won the day in terms of strategy and the structure of the formation of the Organization of African Unity, in the sense that strategically it was gradual in terms of, slowly forming regional organization, and then finally leading to what we call the totality of the African Union that we wanted. So the mere fact that the OAU has helped to form these organizations like East African Community, SADC, ECOWAS, IGAD, COMESA, I think it is something that we could say it is a plus on its part. And then, of course, the OAU facilitated the unification of trade unions in Africa. And then it came up to the element of forming the Organization of African Trade Union. That also came out of the assistance from the organization itself. And then, of course, there were a number of instruments that were formed within the organization that were very important in addressing some of the critical African problems, like the problem of refugees, So in 1969, I think, the OAU adopted the refugee charter that helped really with the UN to deal with the problem of refugees. And then in 1981, there was the adoption of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, something that really addressed the problem of human rights in Africa. And then, of course, the formation of World African Development Bank came out of this element. So in a sense, you could say that there were some achievements that were possible, they were realized within the existence of the OAU. Now, the challenges, there are challenges. Regardless of these achievements, there are challenges. And one, I think, the most of the important challenge for both the OAU then and the AU now is the element of many of African countries, if not all of them, are still poor. So the problem of poverty is one of the largest challenges for the organization. This is nothing but the lack of economic development. And Africa really has to work to better the lives of their people. And second challenge is the element of peace and security in the continent. This is the element of violent political conflicts that have been ravaging this continent. Something that really needs to be addressed, and the organization has to get really in it to make sure that conflicts are being taken care of. The third, of course, challenge to me is the question of environmental degradation. This is nothing but the climate change, the hunger, all these problems that comes out of that. And even the raison d'etre of the formation of some of these regional groupings were about to address this problem of environment. An organization like the IGAD, for instance. IGAD with the double D was the Intergovernmental Organization on Authority on Drought and Development. Finally, it transformed itself to an economic grouping. So the element of environment is very important. Another challenge is lack of employment among the youth. The chair, yesterday President Kikwete was here. He was talking about the young generation. People are being busy chatting. Young people in this continent are idle. No employment, so they have nothing to do. They have plenty, and there is nothing bad like having too much time without doing nothing. You have these evil ideas of going to kill somebody, of going to steal, that kind of stuff. So these young people, they don't have anything to do. There is no employment. So they have this technology of telephones, full time they're chatting. So it's really a big problem. And out of this, one analyst is calling the dilemma of the youth as something he calls Afro-Pessimism. Actually, the young generation is very pessimistic to the extent that sometimes they look down upon everything African. For them, everything African is primitive. So they aspire, and I think this is a really terrible thing, and Africa needs to address it, out of which, if we don't do that, then this will be kind of a time, it is really a problem, and that needs to be addressed. So it's a challenge, actually. Imagine these young people trying to cross the continent, going to Europe, in a big exodus, but a dangerous one, boarding these makeshift boats in the Mediterranean Sea to cross to go to Italy. And they get a lot of problem out of that. So these are all coming out of this problem of unemployment. I'm told now time is up, so I promised I'll be trying to be punctual. But I have to really try to finish it by trying to give some 4 points of how these challenges could be overcome. I think first, Africa should realize the objectives of the Agenda 2063. This is the 50 years agenda, it's like a master plan for Africa to get rid of all these kind of problems that Africa is going through. And then secondly, the AU now will need to empower its technical, legislative, and the judicial institutions so that they can be able to realize the objective. And thirdly, member states must address the problems of budgetary constraints that the AU now is facing. And lastly, there is a need really to make Africa a conflict-free continent. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Dr. Mahundi. Now, as you have heard, many questions have been raised, and I think one is the Pan-Africanism still relevant? And if it is still relevant, there are problems that needs to be addressed. And so what should be done, particularly for the younger generation? Most of the people who are in this room are young people. How much do they know about Pan-Africanism and its agenda. And if they know, or they don't know, if they don't know what should be done to make them not only know, but also subscribe to the Pan-Africanist agenda. Now we have about 30 minutes for discussion. So I'll invite those who would like to contribute. Raise your hand and present or ask your question very briefly. Don't make a speech. And be precise and focused to the issue that you want to raise. 1 to 2 minutes. Okay. You can see some hands. We see one here. I'll take 2 here. I'll take 1 there, another there, and then we'll see. Okay, let's start with you.
Thank you so much. My name is Hilda Gaspar, and my question is, I want to explanation that Pan-Africanism agenda or Pan-Africanism, is that a history to be preserved or a spirit to live on? I can quote Ambassador say that in Africa, youth see everything done in African way is primitive. And I can see there is the big gap between youth seniors and the youth of today in Africa. And by example, you can see even the discussant and the panelists, most of them are seniors. There's no youth in the panel. It's like we're here, youth are here like observers and listeners, but are not the part of the discussion. So I just want to see, the explanation is Pan-Africanism or the African history or African spirit. Is that a history to be preserved? Because you see now, if it was a UN agenda, like issue on United Nations, you will find youth and the panel, most of them. But look, it's about African issue, and the youth are not there. Thank you.
A history or a spirit to be to live on? Okay, thank you very much. A very interesting question. Yes, Ale.
My name is Julius Busungu, Deputy Secretary General of AUDITORIUM. Actually, Mwalimu, when he was fighting for independence, he was just, talking about the normal way of getting independence without using force. But later, he turned to what we call armed struggle in ensuring that the Southern Africa will get independence. Now, when we are talking about Pan-Africanism, we see that it is very difficult for African countries to unite. And what Ambassador Mahmoud said about the OAU, I think the OAU and later the AU, definitely they cannot achieve what they think they can do because they don't have the power to sustain themselves. What do I mean by that? It is the actual way of looking back, and then what he called the things change, and the more they remain the same. By not changing dramatically, that's why things are remaining the same. You change OAU, it becomes IAU, and it will be a problem. Therefore, I think we must first ensure that Africa has its own military unit. That's the first thing. The second thing, they must involve in what we call research and development to ensure that technological issues are only adhered to. And the third thing is that I think the best way to do away with this is also to ensure the political will be shared among the Africans, maybe to form another special unit, what we can call the United Republic of Africa.
Thank you very much. Yes, there was, yeah.
Thank you. My question goes to Ambassador. A question that was been posed, is Pan-Africanism still relevant? I still need an answer to that. And my point would be it's still relevant because Africa is where it is because of the spirit that founded this continent. I come from Uganda, and some of us in Uganda, when you hear Nyerere, is like your neighbor. Everywhere you go, when our president stands to speak, he talks of Nyerere. Actually, he said the Muslims go to Mecca for pilgrimage. The Christians go to Israel for pilgrimage. I go to Tanzania for my political pilgrimage. Let's appreciate that man, Baba wa Taifa. I heard that statement when I was still young, and I'm glad this event has been made in this university. Our president was in this university. But you would not have never seen M7 if that man, the one you call Baba wa Taifa, and thank you Tanzania for that, if he never believed in the young people. And I agree with that lady that she said. Where are the youths in the equation, Mr. Honorable Ambassador? What are the initiatives that have been set up to carry the same spirit that the Nyerere's had? They may not have done everything. I will quote what he said, and I'm glad he admitted. He said, my generation led Africa to political freedom, but this current generation must add on. Don't you think the West people have this additional? I thank you, Ambassador, but it's like you're trying to convince us that OAU or AU has. You're like trying to preach to us that we should appreciate her impact. It would be a shame to discuss that point and say it has not. That Africa has her own story. We are making progress. That the West, 400 years have been very far. We must appreciate that. That Africa has a history, but we are going somewhere. So my point is this: what are those initiatives that this spirit of Pan-Africanism that made this man to believe in the young people that passed this university, believed in the Museveni's young people?
Thank you, thank you.
So that is my question.
What should be done?
What should be done to echo that spirit of Pan-Africanism, that the spirit of Nyerere,
that's the question.
That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Joseph Malekela. I'm a third-year student of Philosophy and Ethics. I have one question to the Ambassador. So from the presentation and the experience that we have since the beginning of this struggle of Pan-Africanism until to date, the gradual change that have been achieved, I think, don't you think that we are somehow diverging from this movement of Pan-Africanism from being a movement of ownership, of feeling, feeling the being an African and unit of other African people? Don't you think now we are diverging to be into the diplomatic things, like they say, now we have the Pan-African Parliament, now we have the AU, but also we have these regional integrations. But don't you think there is a gap between these diplomatic things that we are doing at the upper level compared to what is happening in the ground? Are we really proud to be Africans? Let's say a Tanzanian in South Africa, for instance. Are we really feeling that kind of unity as Africans? Don't you think there is a quite big gap and something has to be done from the individual levels to build that spirit of ownership and feelingness of the Africans? Thank you.
Okay. Next.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Ngila Mwase. I was privileged to study in this university and also teach here. Mine is just a comment on the last point made by the first speaker with respect to the turning point in South Africa in 1994 with the coming into power of Nelson Mandela, where the economy was left intact without being restructured, and therefore white privileges continued, where the nuclear program was not handed over, and where the men of apartheid were not punished or not seriously punished. Now this has, in fact, this is the reason why I stood up. This has led South Africans, particularly the youth, to point fingers at President Mandela as a sellout. But by the way, the word sellout was the worst thing you could be called in the 60s and 70s. I say sellout, say a person who betrayed the Africans, etc., etc. I've always felt that Mandela was following the dictates of Kwame Nkrumah, seek ye first the political kingdom, and all else can be added on later on. And future leaders, if we wanted to point fingers at, would point at future South African leaders who are failing to transform the economy. We must also note that South Africa is the only place where we fought wars of national liberation, where the army remained completely against the final outcome, was not in line with the political leadership, the white political leadership. In actual fact, in 1992, the white army planned a coup against the last white president, President Frederick de Klerk. President de Klerk had to fire 24 generals, usually referred to as the net of generals. Also removed a very notorious former army commander who Mandela was courageous enough to put on trial. So I'm just trying to explain that at that juncture, the outcome in 94 was actually a compromise, where the big powers put pressure on the apartheid regime with the pressure of sanctions to compromise. African leaders also put pressure on the liberation movements to negotiate, and this is how the outcome in 94 happened. But I think the younger generation should reflect on the situation as it was in 94 and not necessarily pinpoint fingers at Nelson Mandela. Questions are always asked. Okay. This is my last point.
Thank you.
My last sentence, they always ask a question in South Africa. Who was the most useless president? Who has been the most useless president? Fingers are pointed not at Jacob Zuma or Thabo Mbeki, but at Mandela. I rose up to say that Mandela is a historical figure along the lines of Nkrumah, Nyerere, and others.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we are. No. Behind.
Thank you. My name is Elijah Kondi. I'm a faculty member at the University of Dar Es Salaam. My question is to Ambassador. You have explained to us about the changes from OAU to AU. And one of the areas in relation to peace and conflict is the move from the doctrine of non-interference to the doctrine of non-indifference. But earlier this year, on February, AU marked 20th anniversary. And one of the areas that they discussed was in relation to peace and security. And the one thing that came out very clearly was that in Africa there is immensity of African paralysis in dealing with when their neighbors are burning up in flames. That we have a tradition of basically keeping quiet and not condemning when our neighbors are facing conflict or problems. So with that movement to shift from non-interference to non-indifference, to what extent can AU actually address the conflict that are facing in other African countries?
And then I'll let the panelists respond. Uko, yes, huyo aliyesimama.
Thanks. My name is Leticia from Yusuf Makamba. My question is, how can we overcome the challenge facing AU? Thank you.
Okay. Another one? Yes, on the same side.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, for this special opportunity which you have given to me. My question goes to Dr. Mohamed Maundi. We have seen the challenges which have faced the OAU, which current is AU, and we have seen the achievement. So my question is, one of the function or one of the aim of AU is to protect and make sure the peace and security of Africa. So we have different countries which face wars and different conflicts. So where is the function of AU to this kind of conflicts and wars to other countries which face these problems in Africa?
Thank you. I have to read this one and let the panelists respond. This is from someone who doesn't want to identify himself or herself, and it goes like this. OAU is a donor-dependent body, and Africa is subordinate, peripheral, and an agent of great power manipulation. In your view, I don't know whose view, Mahundi or her. In your view, how relevant is this assertion? And how then should we go forward? Should Africa perhaps seek to unite in line with Samuel Amin's proposal for the linking? Okay, so those are the questions. We have several. Most are directed to Ambassador. Can you start responding to some of the questions? But most are similar, though. Most of the questions raised, if you cluster them, I think we have about 3 or 4 questions, basically. You can sit here and respond.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'm happy that there have been numerous questions, and all of them are really good questions. Let me start with the first one, whether the Pan-Africanism is a history to be put in an archive or a ritual thing really to live on. I will go for the latter, or I will go for both of them. History is part of our life. It's where we are coming from and where we are now and where we chart to go. So the historical part should be very important. Mind you, when the Pan-Africanism started, it started out of Africa, but it involved people of African descent, particularly black people. So they were talking about the problem of the 20th century being the problem of color line between whites and blacks. So that was typical of the reality of the environment of Pan-Africanism in its diaspora. But then, come 1945, after the Second World War, Pan-African was brought home by people like Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Julius. These who went outside to study and those who went to fight wars, they interacted with the people from the Caribbean and America. So they had this common idea of really bringing the aspiration of the freedom of Africans, or rather black people. But bringing now Africa, Pan-Africa back to Africa, you will get problem really of looking at purely from its origin, fighting for the black. Because in Africa, we are majority black, but then we have Arabs in Africa. Now, are they part of the Pan-Africanism? Of course, yes. When Africanism is taken now to be a liberation movement for decolonization and for economic development, definitely it involves people of Missouri, it involves Libyans, it involves Tunisians, and all of this kind of stuff. So the historical part that was particularly black should be part of our history, because it's the one that really guided us to point that we brought Pan-Africanism back to Africa. So for me, I think it is both. It's a historical thing to be preserve, but it's also spiritual for us to live on. Now, another question is this, I think it's from my brother from South Africa or somewhere else, somebody who was talking about Africa having its own military. This is an element, part of the element of the idea of having continental unity. Because Nkrumah, when he was talking about the United States of Africa, his idea was exactly like somebody said, of first winning the political kingdom, and then everything will follow into the pigeonholes. Now, the idea of Nkrumah was to have a very strong intercontinental unity that will use one foreign policy, a continental foreign policy, a continental defense policy, as well as a continental monetary policy. So it was the integration that was really in total. But then that call wasn't accepted by each and everybody, so it failed. But now, in the contemporary, the AU is grappling with the problem of conflicts in Africa. And it's very ironic when it comes of the problem of conflict in Africa. When Africans want to persecute their wars, they are always capable of mobilizing resources to fight their wars. Be it the belligerents, be it the government, everybody is comfortable finding whatever one wants to fight, and the fight goes on. But when it comes to solving that problem of conflict, we always cry and beg for assistance from outside. It is a shame on the part of Africa. So in terms of its kind of transformation, the AU now is talking about African peace and security architecture, something that really has to address the problem of conflict and to solve it within African continent itself. And then there is this call within the AU of solving African problems by African solution. So this kind of pronunciation, they all aim at something called self-reliance that Mwalimu really fought and kind of preached again and again. Africa needs to be self-reliant, not only in terms of economics, but in terms of peace and security. Now, Professor Adem was talking about the issue of the African peace and security architecture financed by outside Africa, and it's true. I mean, if you go to Addis Ababa today, you find the headquarters of the AU is a really posh kind of environment, big buildings close to the UN. Actually, I would say the African Union headquarters is better than the UN the headquarters in New York. Big buildings and everything, but it's all made by the Chinese. Thank you, because you see, Africa has even, how would I say it? It has kind of modified its ways of relationship with outside world. We moved from donor aspect, we come to this idea of partnership. So the Chinese, being one of the best partners, they're doing for a favor for us of building those kind of structure. But frankly, the protection of individual house should be done by oneself. Yourself, you have to be responsible for defending your own rights. So the aspect of peace and security now, as we speak, almost 90% of it is foreign financed. And that is a shame, really. So if Africa really wants to solve its conflict problem, Africans have to contribute to that. Short of that, I think it becomes a problem. And another, the final one I'm talking about, I'm asking to deal with the final one, is this element of the youth. Again, it is coming up and up again. Well, frankly speaking, the young generation is the future for this continent. And it needs to be armed, and it needs to be prepared to take over the responsibility. And for me, if you ask me, I'll say, youth, stand up for your rights. And where did that start? You start with education. Be educated. That is one. But then get into the political kingdom that Nkrumah was talking about. Get into politics. Get into politics. Take over. You know, I was in SADC headquarters in Gaborone. I stayed there for 2 years when they were operationalizing this protocol on defense and security cooperation. So I went into Zimbabwe during the problem with the EU. I know there was a boycott from the European. So we were talking to the young generation in Zimbabwe.
we say, you are having problem with your president? And the young people say, yes. And we're asking them, what is the problem? He said, no, they have outlived their time. And I said, so what are you going to do? And then they told me, what do we have to do? The only legitimacy Mugabe has, now here I'm mentioning a name because they mentioned it themselves. They say the only legitimacy Mugabe has is because they went into the bush to get the independence of this country. Now we are asking them to get back the country to the bush. We'll go there and get it ourselves. And they was like, oh my God. That is a very good statement. So young generation has to do the same. Get into politics. Take power from there, and you can know where you are going to get this continent to, because the future of this continent is in your hands. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mauti. Lupa.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I only have a general comment, and I think which will probably answer most of the questions that have been raised from the floor. Now, reading from Agiman's paper, I think the first thing is telling us, and especially with the relation to this question of history or relevance of Pan-Africanism. The first thing, I think the importance of history and what is telling us is that we should be able to identify the enemy, because who is the enemy? Who is the enemy of Africa? Or the language he uses here is the enemy of a black race. This is a race that has been put down by everybody, and it has been subjected to all kinds of torture and bondages and all the things you know about. So who is the enemy? So number one, we have to identify the enemy, and then who is the victim? I think it's very clear here that the victim is the black man all over the world. And then he gives us examples from history of people who have fallen down, of other races. Of course, he uses the term race. Some people may find it contentious. But of other races which fell down and eventually found their way or rose up eventually. But in many cases, they did that through unity. They came together as unified people, and they overcame their problem. And he's giving a lot of examples. I didn't have time to go through all that, from the United States of America, from the way it organized itself. It identified its potential, and it organized itself to realize that potential. From China, the examples of China, the examples of India, the example of military strength is talking of defense, and that is very important, because short of that, then it is very difficult to attain any of the goals that we want to attain as an African people. Now, the use of African, I think, is also contentious, because it goes contrary to what Ambassador Maund is talking about, that what is Africa and who belongs to Africa. Actually, he laments the African National Congress in the paper, that, and because there was the African National Congress in South Africa and the Pan-African Congress, which stood for which said Africa belongs to Africans, and by Africans they meant black Africans. And so the compromise came because ANC embraced a universal kind of ideology, which Ageman doesn't agree with. He says Africa, it should be the Africans, and they should know who are their enemies, because short of that, they may invite people in their midst who are actually their enemies. That is what he was saying.
Thank you very much, panelists. And we have come to the end of this panel, and I will just mention a few things. One, Is Pan-Africanism relevant? I think it is still relevant. It's only how we present it to the youth. Sometimes we present it in terms of African unity for the sake of it. That's not how Nkrumah and Nyerere presented Pan-Africanism and African unity. African unity is an instrument of liberation. Mwalimu will talk about meaningful liberation. Cabral will talk about true African liberation or total African liberation. So basically, African liberation is not complete, and I think there is a topic in the program that is going to address that question. So, but two, history. History is important, not for the sake of itself, but as a teacher, we draw lessons from our past experiences, but it also inspires us. So in relation to Pan-Africanism, I think we draw experiences from our past. What did the Pan-Africanism did for us in the past, and what can it do for us in the future? And lastly, what should be done? I think one of the things that has been happening at this university is this particular festival. And 10 years ago, one of the forum, or the festival, in one of the forum, students said that the University of Dar es Salaam doesn't have a course on Pan-Africanism. And the university administration, I think Professor Mkandala by then was the vice chancellor, took it up. And a course on Pan-Africanism was started. Okay. So yes, youth could do something, can push things and push changes along the lines of the Pan-Africanist agenda. Having said that, thank you very much, and I would like now to invite the next panel. And Professor Mohamed Bakari, who is the chair, please come forward and talk over and invite the panelists for the next session. Thank you very much.